Okay, hey, welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today I have another great review for you from the brand Baltic. A little about them. This French micro brand really aims to offer timeless pieces of the highest quality for fair prices. Another thing to note is that these are designed, assembled, and adjusted in France. In terms of the type of watch, this is a traveler's watch. Some key characteristics in design, which you're looking for a traveler. Of course, you're going to want that GMT or world time function, so you're able to track multiple time zones with relative ease. This is their Aquascaphe GMT in the gray colorway, and it's a tool watch designed for diving while also being perfect for everyday use. You guys may recognize this basic silhouette as I actually personally own the Aquascaphe Classic, which is just a basic dive watch, but man, it doesn't feel basic at all. It's actually really nice. Very simple, just super balanced, just the things that you kind of have come to expect from Baltic. But I'm really happy that Baltic was able to lend in this GMT model because I've actually always kind of had my eye on it. I love the colorway here, the contrast, everything just really fits, everything really flows. And again, that is something that is very unique to their brand. You can actually get this for €1,000 direct, or roughly $1,800 US at the time of recording this. And for me, I think it's actually quite a deal. So with all that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get this piece in hand, and take a closer look. Okay guys, so same really nice, well-balanced silhouette as the Aquascaphe Classic Diver, but of course now in a GMT. Also, it's going to have slightly less water resistance at only 100 versus the typical 200 of the dedicated diver. But in terms of the case proportions and everything, very similar. 38 millimeters in diameter. That's the actual case, but you can see there is some overhang on this gorgeous bezel with just fantastic grip. The knurling that's in there is just beautiful. It's actually 39.5 at the bezel, which is going to make it visually appear just a bit larger, which is great. Gives you a little bit of wrist presence considering it's only 38 millimeters. And it's not going to be oversized because again, it's still only 38 millimeters. In terms of height, it's going to be 13.4 millimeters, and that's including that crystal. And it's only about 11.5 without the crystal. So you can see still really nice and felt beautifully thin mid case there. Big crown, you have a little bit of case back protrusion, and then of course the bezel protrusion on the upper side. 47 millimeters lug to lug stainless steel, brushed with a few polished accents here and there, mainly brushed though, but this particular flat link bracelet option does add a bit of bling and a little bit more polishing, but I think it looks really good. Of course, I adore the beads of rice, which is what I have my personal Aquascaphe Classic on, but this flat link is really beautifully done, and really done to a nice high level, and you can see the light play on there is just really nice. Now, getting into the bezel, another difference is this one's bidirectional. So that means it can go both directions, and it's 24 click. So very nice, very precise when setting there if you are going to decide to offset. And then of course you do have the dual tone in terms of kind of nighttime hours, daytime hours. So excuse me. So very nice, very clean. Just I love the balance of the blue and the gray, and then of course another shade of kind of bluish gray there on that GMT hand, the blacked out dial. Now you're not going to get the partially sandwiched dial of the diver. Here it's going to be a bit more uniform, which I think it actually works really well, for this instance. Although I do like the semi-sandwich finish on the dive model, I think it's nice to differentiate. And of course, they differentiate it in a way that I think is still quite aesthetically pleasing. I love how dark and inky this black dial is. Let's just take a look at that. Really nice. You can see that's another big difference. This is going to be glossy black versus the Diver had a nice granular texture, which of course did play with a lot of light and absorb a lot of it, so it would have a more of kind of anthracite tones depending on the light. Here, this is just going to be a very, very deep, dark, inky black, pretty much regardless of lighting conditions there. Of course, you can get reflections and whatnot off of the dial and then also off of the crystal, but the crystal itself is a sapphire and it is double domed, and it does even have an anti-reflective coating there, so that's helping fight against everything. But man, look at that dial and the reflectivity on the gloss. There's something just really natural about it, and it just flows beautifully, especially under the light. Now, the crown is, of course, screw down and signed. On the case back, you get this really cool engraving, as you can see here, which really breaks out essentially the different time offsets. So if you did want to set your hour hand to GMT time, the nice thing is what you could do is then you would actually understand every offset for every other location, so you could calculate. And that's, for me, is what I would typically use the bezel for, is not to track a third time zone, right? Because you have your main hour hand, and then you have your GMT hand, and then you have this, which would be pretty much the tertiary time zone. You do primary and secondary here, and then tertiary on the outside. Instead of tracking a third one, I would use this really just to calculate the offset for another time zone. And this is a collar style GMT, although you can't see the movement inside. It is the very reliable and robust Swiss automatic Soprod C125 collar style GMT. And I know some people aren't super thrilled with Soprod. This isn't one of their Newton movements. This is one of their more standard movements, which means that it performs a bit better. It has 42-hour power reserve, beats at 4 hertz, and really people don't seem to have any problems with this particular one, which is more based on their regular architecture, that kind of Seiko based architecture that the A10, I believe, is built off of, which is just kind of the 4L and now 6L architecture from Seiko. So very nice, very clean, works impeccably, and again, you just don't hear a lot of problems with these movements. And of course, it's not Swiss made because it is assembled in France, so it doesn't matter that it does have a Swiss made movement in terms of the designation. Now, getting into the dial, again, just beautifully done, glossy black printed dial. You get that beveled date window there at 6 o'clock. You can see a little bit of sheen coming off of it. It's not only beveled, but it also is framed, which is nice because it goes with that outer track, which help push everything kind of more centralized on the dial, which also shrink the proportions, which is very nice, and it helps it feel a bit smaller, because typically if you had this smaller insert, right, in terms of the bezel to dial ratio, it could make the dial be quite large, feel expansive, maybe even oversized. Here, you're just kind of squeezing all that back, and it just adds a certain level of refinement and tidiness that, for me, work really, really well aesthetically, visually. It is definitely very, very handsome. Again, water resistant to 100 meters. It does have a screw down crown, so it's a trustworthy 100 meters. The drilled lugs are still present here on the same case, but you are getting quick release spring bars, and then also some upgrades. You're going to see screw pins there for these beautiful links. There are no half links because these are all pretty much as short as half links, which also means you can save some space on the clasp itself, which only has 2 positions. Again, you don't need more positions if you can just separate out the links, so that works beautifully. And then also, of course, you do have this very nice milled folding clasp section, as well as a nice push button release there, nicely signed with the 2-tone finish. So really, really nice. But with all that said, let's actually get this piece off. Let's get it on the wrist and see how it wears. Okay guys, as you can see on my 7.5" wrist, this wears just beautifully. Of course, if I do get my wrist a little bit too close to the camera, there's gonna be a little bit of perspective distortion. So what I'm gonna do is leave my wrist nice and low here and just tighten the frame up so you guys can get a bit of a truer aspect ratio of how this might render on your own wrist. A little bit too close, sorry about that. Check this piece out. Wow, look at the light play off of the beautiful flat link there. Just so much fun, very organic the way that it plays with the light. And then you go ahead and take a look at that inky black dial, very high contrast, nice bright colors there in the bezel, really popping, really standing out, and really just ultimately legible. You can see it rides very flat on the wrist. That mid case looks so thin and sharp, and then of course you do have a nice little bit of overhang for the bezel, which is going to be very, very useful in terms of articulation and that tactile engagement. Again, 24 clicks, 24 settings. It really just is a match made in heaven. Wow, I am digging this one a whole lot, and you can see why. Look at the way that it just sits. And then of course, again, you do have the option, of course, to get it on a strap or on a beads of rice bracelet if you want a little bit more of that kind of retro aesthetic. Although this is also quite retro. I don't know, there's something about this bracelet, it just, I think, gives it a bit more of a luxurious feel. It's a bit more high-end feeling, whereas I think the beads of rice, although it can be a bit dressy because of the polished elements, it still ultimately feels very tooly because of just the types of watches you would normally see a beads of rice bracelet on. Whereas the flat link, I don't know, there's just a little bit of extra layer of elegance there, and I dig that. Look at how it just sits on this wrist. And again, I don't have a very flat wrist, right? I have a 7.5" wrist, but it's a very round wrist, so you're getting a good amount of thickness there. It's not all just here across. So even with my wrist, you know, it doesn't look oversized, undersized. It's just beautifully balanced, and a lot has to do with the way that it plays with proportions. Smaller dial, you know, but an expansive dial at the same time, thinner bezel, but the bezel overhangs. It's very nice, balanced and minimal case there at just 38mm. There's definitely a lot to love. So with that said, let's go ahead, get this piece off the wrist, set it for some Lume shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. Wow, check that out. Now again, although it doesn't have that 200 meters of water resistance, you're still getting that screw down crown, and you're getting real dive watch legibility when it comes to this Lume. Beautifully applied, it glows very bright, and you can see that green hue is just fantastic. And the nice thing is, even in daylight, it was rendering very white. It didn't have a bunch of tint to it. So that's typically a hallmark of really well applied Lume and just well thought out and executed application. But one thing I always like to work in is of course a little bit of low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming in and out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or maybe just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it is nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. So maybe include some harsh lighting, which might expose any type of production defects. But here, all you're going to see is just the beautiful deep luster on those high polished portions, as well as the beautifully refined and consistent way that the light is gliding over that brushing. Very, very well done. And again, this isn't a super expensive watch. It's not super cheap, but it just does feel like they used effort. You can feel the level of effort when it comes to the excellence in execution, the sharpness. No, it doesn't have a bunch of luxury elements to it, but it is, and it's not finished to a luxury level, but it just captures that class, that refinement that typically is associated with more vintage timepieces, which have developed into luxury timepieces, right? When you think about Rolex, I mean, they're a sports watch company, and of course, their old steel sports watches are some of the most desirable today. There's something that they capture within the imagination, but they're also so ultimately capable and desirable. That's really where you kind of get some magic to happen. So I think you get a little bit of that similar magic here. No, I'm not saying this is a Rolex alternative or it even looks like a Rolex. What I am saying is there's a bit of that magic there, that balance, that refinement that I really love. So closing thoughts on the wrist, very classic proportions. This thing could fit almost any situation. Timeless aesthetic. That extra glossy reflectiveness does add to the vintage aesthetic, whether you're thinking about the crystal, whether you're thinking about that sapphire insert for the bezel or the glossy dial or these beautiful high polished end sections of the 3-link style bracelets. So it all kind of just comes together. It feels very retro and vintage inspired, and it really nails it. And then in terms of model variants, there's an all black dial option with the blue nighttime bezel scale and a choice of either gray as seen or green or orange in terms of the daytime accent colors. So essentially it's going to be this watch, but you can kind of choose what the accent color is going to be. So you replace the gray for green, or you could replace that gray for orange. And of course, some of the other accent colors on the hands and whatnot and the text are going to be a little bit different, but that's the general gist of some of the options for this piece. In terms of comparable models, there are definitely a lot of vintage inspired GMTs in the independent microbrand space across a wide range of price points, depending on movement origin, with kind of Japanese powered GMTs ranging between $400 to all the way up to $1,000. And, especially when you start thinking of those Miyota powered, micro brands that do have that nice traveler's style GMT. But when it comes to Swiss powered GMTs, those are typically going to fall between $1,000 and $2,000. I mean, none of those are going to have a local jump hour. Those are all going to be collar or office style GMTs, which this is one of, and it's actually on the lower end at right about $1,000. There are some really nice, very luxurious pieces, don't get me wrong, that are going to be the upwards of $2,000 and kind of within that price point. And those are beautiful, but technically they're going to be a little bit more modern. They're going to be a little bit more sedate. They're going to have a little bit of less flair, although they're going to be finished to a higher level. Overall, you're going to get something that might be a little less exciting than this. And to me, the Baltic does excite me with its design ethos, its design language, where it's just a really handsome thing to look at, and it's really well balanced. And the cool thing is that Baltic has a design language that crosses over multiple models, and I think it's a really handsome one. And every time I see a new model, I fall a little bit in love with something new. So yes, this is going to be more expensive than your typical Aquascaphe, especially considering most of those are going to have Miyota movements. So I would love to see them do a Miyota powered version, a variation of this watch with the 9075. But I mean, in the meantime, this Soprod is doing a great job. And again, it's still a Swiss movement, Swiss made, and they're not charging you that much for that markup. It is going to cost more just because the movement costs more, but ultimately, again, these are designed, assembled, and adjusted. So in terms of timekeeping, they do adjust every one of these, so they're always keeping great time. So yeah, there's definitely a lot to love here. So for bottom line, guys, this is one of the most handsome and balanced vintage style GMTs on the market. And I emphasize vintage style. There are some more modern, more contemporary options that are out there, more luxurious options, more tooly options. For me, this really strikes that chord in terms of that vintage inspired style. They just do it right. They execute the theme just perfectly. So with that said, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you like the video, please do it like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.